Force brat and has joined the Army. I grew up as an Army brat and joined the Air Force. My father was an armor officer, primarily over in Germany and then over on the east coast of the mainland as well. Spent a couple years in the Army and then chose to get out. But first off, thank you for letting me come and talk to y'all. I really do appreciate it. Been able to talk to some of the Army folks that are on the island as well as some of the other Marine folks over the past couple of months. And one thing that I've noticed is regardless of what type of uniform the folks wear, and really regardless of what type of careers we do, either military or civilian, a lot of the principles for success are very similar for everybody across the board. But before I go too far, as Lieutenant Colonel Carson said, my background is primarily flying F-15 and F-Bs, Iraq, Afghanistan, a few other places as well. But I'd really like to kind of get a sense of where you all are going to be going once you get your commissions here, I think in what, about a month or so? Is that right?
27 days.
Congratulations.
27 days, 4 hours, 2 minutes.
That's awesome.
You guys are playing.
That is awesome. So if you don't mind, if we could please, just really quick, what branch you'll be going into, if you don't mind.
Cadet Flowers, I'm going to be a AG officer.
AG, okay.
Cadet Cube Signal.
Signal.
Cadet Amado, Quartermaster.
Cadet Leader, sir. Signal Corps and Reserves.
Okay.
Cadet Marine Transportation.
Okay.
Cadet Two Finance Corps.
Finance.
Sir, Cadet Kalma, also nursing.
Okay.
Cadet Rodriguez, AG.
Cadet Redding, infantry.
27 days, infantry.
Infantry.
Right on. All right.
Cadet Robbins, medical services, sir.
Cadet Carlos, sir, MI.
Okay.
Cadet Harrison, Armor.
Armor.
Cadet Scully, transportation.
Cadet Dolan, it's not set in stone yet, but combat control.
Combat control. Okay, we can talk definitely afterwards. We've got a couple of folks here on the island that could get a lot.
Cadet Silva, nursing.
Cadet Low, infantry, sir.
Cadet Camp Medical Service, sir.
Cadet Mahoney, Field Artillery, sir.
Cadet Vivalta, sir, Signal. Cadet Turner, Ordnance, sir.
Cadet Proctor, medical.
Cadet Gibson, infantry.
Cadet King, chaplain, candidate.
Okay.
Cadet Manning, aviation, sir.
Right on. What do you think you'll be flying?
Hopefully Apache, sir.
Apaches? Nice. Right on. Right on. No, I asked that because for a couple different reasons, because it goes back to kind of the opening comments as well, where we said that really kind of leadership and really success in the military kind of transcends all different career fields. Because I think one thing that you may notice once you enter the Army or the Air Force is you're going to see that as you go to infantry, as you go to aviation, as you go to the medical career fields, you may have a tendency to get very stovepiped for about the first 6 to 8 years of your career. And I'll tell you that as a senior officer, I think that that is good up to an extent. Because without a doubt, as a senior officer, when I'm looking at a young lieutenant or a young captain, that competence and that expertise within their MOS or their AFSC is absolutely one of the first discriminators, is making sure that they know exactly what they're doing. The second thing is that leadership competency. And leadership competency is really going to vary depending upon what career field you're in. You know, from an aviation perspective, if you're flying Apaches, your leadership may just be the other person that's in that Apache with you, or it could be everybody that is within that squadron or that unit. Whereas in nursing, obviously, your leadership may be spur of the moment crisis action depending upon what the status of your patient is. So there's a lot of different leadership techniques out there with that. But I do want to ask one other question. Everybody's heard about a lot of the turbulence, you know, we've been talking about within the Department of Defense. You know, from an Air Force perspective, it's going down to 300,000 people sequestration. From an Army, it's maybe going down to 420,000 people as we potentially downsize and close overseas bases. You know, what's going to happen with ISIS on the ground in Iraq and Syria, things like that. What are some of the concerns that you have as you get ready to be commissioned into the Army? Any big issues from that? Everything's good to go? Yeah.
Sir, I think from our perspective, going into commission, we're pretty much set in stone. We feel comfortable with where we're going. But we may get into a unit to where our soldiers don't know where they're going to be, if they're going to be allowed to come back, or one mistake might push them out of the military. So that plays on their psyche. So in order to, I guess, empower them, or to give them that confidence of just because we're downsizing doesn't mean you're going to be that one cut. So for me, that's something that I think about going into the force, what about my soldier's perspective, not just for mine with the downside, but what about their perspective of where we're going?
Right on.
With the downsides, there'll be less positions for key development, sir, so in that aspect, it'll be more competitive among peers.
Yeah, I would say that, I'll go to your comment here first. One of the best ways, I think, as a young leader, is to look at that is transparency. I mean, you're gonna be a second lieutenant, so you're gonna have, hopefully a very qualified NCO/senior NCO that you can work closely with. But people are gonna recognize, as a second lieutenant, you don't necessarily have that expertise or that experience in order to answer a question, to figure out how this, how the turbulence is gonna affect your soldiers. The best thing that you can do is try to find out that information and try to get back to them and just be as honest and open as possible with them. You mentioned kind of a one mistake military. One of the other reasons we came over here is one of our E3s in Airman First Class. We're looking at him getting into a commissioning program here at NOAA. And there was discussion about, well, we've had some cadets that have made mistakes. Stellar cadet, great GPA, but they made this one mistake and then they got kicked out. So in some regards, there is a one mistake type of a mentality. But a lot of times it really depends on what that mistake is. In this case, is a DUI. There's things, UCMJ, that as long as your soldiers know that there's things, there's that threshold of what we can and can't accept, then that is really where that one mistake mentality comes from. From a leadership perspective, this is just a personal opinion. When we start talking about one mistakes and those type of things, sometimes I think there's a tendency in the military to maybe be a little overly harsh, as opposed to maybe understanding the broader context of why something happened. So from a leader, I would recommend that what you do is if something happens, some guy fails a test, something happens to a soldier, maybe take a little step back before we jump to a conclusion and just maybe try to figure out the context. There may be something that is going on in that soldier's life. There may be a family issue, there may be a personal issue that is really kind of affecting what he is doing. So probably the best way is to make sure that folks don't make a mistake because they understand what the requirements are. But then if a mistake is made, understanding the context for it. Because the last thing you want is folks, I think especially, well, really in any MLS, you don't want folks to be too gun shy, right? You don't want them just to kind of sit back and think, man, if I make a mistake, my leadership is just going to crush me. Because if that happens, it's not only is it stifled innovation, it's stifled creativity, and quite honestly, it's stifled mission effectiveness as well. So, as far as kind of what you were talking about, as far as one of the concerns out there, the saying that we have, at least in my unit, is there's with all the sequestration, with all the cutbacks and all the uncertainty, there's really three things that we have to make sure that we always focus on regardless. And it's really, it's safety, it's security, and it's leadership development are kind of the big three. Because I think you'll find that, especially for a lot of these younger folks, even for some of the older folks that you might have in your unit, if you kind of focus on their safety and their security, you'll find that that creates a very positive environment for them to execute the mission. You create that positive environment, and you'll be amazed. We have a second lieutenant. It's incredible the amount of thrust that he has. Man, he just wants to go. He wants to do stuff. You have to kind of temper that a little bit with a senior NCO's experience and the vectoring out there. But it's kind of that tailoring that allows them to get that accomplished because you set that environment. And then the second thing is the leadership development. I got to tell you, you take a look at like guys like us. We've got 20 years of experience, but you guys pretty much have 20 years of potential, And it's how do we take that experience that you have as a leader and translate it to so that potential for that follow-on generation is even greater. And I think that's one of the most significant issues that we're facing in the military is making sure that we translate that potential to actual execution. If that makes sense. So that was that side of the room. This side, concerns. What do you say? Questions? What you got?
Wait on me, sir?
Yeah.
I can't think of it yet.
Yeah.
Sir, just for the transition for the military as a whole, from like how we're going to change from a really war era military to maybe possibly a garrison type of military in the near future with the war drawing down, and just a adjustment and change to it, sir.
To go from a wartime to a garrison, it depends how you look at that. I would say, you know, I've been in the military since 1995. And we've always said, well, you know, we're kind of a peacetime military, but then we got these things that pop up, you know. Please have a seat. Come on in. Come on in. Please have a seat.
Hey, Aaron. Can you move
Question.
your... You good, Aaron? Come on. What's going on? Hi, Carson.
So we talk about, from the military, we go from a wartime to a peacetime. There's always things that are gonna be popping up. In my experience, you know, we've never really fought a full-scale war, except for, you know, the 3 weeks that we invaded Iraq from March of 2003 until April 2003. But my God, we've been deployed an awful lot, you know, be it in Afghanistan, be it in the Balkans, places like that. So I think that you'll find that even if we say that it is an in-garrison, there's still gonna be a significant number of deployments for your unit. Really, the biggest issue that I would say there is how do you, as the leader, how do you make sure that all the requirements that your soldiers need, how can we best meet those requirements so that they're best prepared in order to actually execute that mission. Let's be honest, you know, as a platoon leader, or as a second lieutenant or a first lieutenant, your ability to garner resources may be somewhat limited, right? But from a colonel perspective, you know, like kind of like a brigade type perspective, if I've got a lieutenant that is saying, hey, I need to have this, and this, that goes a long way to making sure that I've got, I can try to help get those resources for you. More than anything, I just, as a senior leader, and I think I can speak from pretty much every colonel out there, we just want to make sure that we get an honest assessment from really the frontline leaders as to what is needed in order to accomplish that mission. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, sir.
All right.
What are some things that you've done in the past to prepare your subordinates for a deployment or something like that?
You know, it's interesting. The first thing that sprung to mind when you asked that question was we took care of their families. We really did. Because from my previous experience, I was a fighter squadron commander, and from 2011 to 2012, we deployed to a Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. And the demographics of our unit, it's a little bit different than an Army type unit, probably very similar to what you'll see in your aviation units. We had a lot of lieutenants and captains. We had 3 majors, and then I was a lieutenant colonel at the time. But these were a lot of folks that had never deployed before, so there was a lot of anxiety, especially with on the family side, as to what to expect. You know, my God, we're going to Afghanistan. We're going to actually be boots on the ground over there. So the first thing is to try to allay that anxiety, to make sure that the families have that support network back home. And from really just a leader perspective, is to make sure that a lot of the base support facilities and agencies, they were equipped in order to take care of the families and understand the family needs. And for us, it was the Airman Family and Readiness Center, kind of like, you know, the Soldier Family Readiness Center, as well as, ironically, a lot of the medical facilities, because we had a lot of folks that lived off base that we wanted to make sure that they still felt part of that military community. So that was job number 1, is to take care of the families. Because, you know, man, I mean, if we take care of the families, that allows the soldiers, the airmen, to focus much more on the mission, because they're not concerned with what's happening 8,000 miles away. The second thing is within the unit itself, what we really focused on was making sure that the guys had the tactical competency. So we understood the mission, and this started, no kidding, probably about 4 to 6 months out in earnest. We made sure that the guys were able to understand, first off, what that operating environment is. For us, it was, you know, we were stationed in North Carolina, just east of Fayetteville. So, you know, flat lands, a lot of trees, not a whole lot of, it wasn't similar to Afghanistan at all, you know, 20,000-foot mountains. So for us, it was, well, how do we make sure our guys are safe as they're flying around, especially at night, low altitude, you know, trying to support the guys on the ground. So first off, making sure that they were safe with that, then understanding the tactics that would be involved. One of the things that we don't do very well as a military as a whole is we don't do a whole lot of joint integration until you start getting up into that major lieutenant colonel level. You know, we send guys to go be at the Air Support Operations Squadron at the corps level, so they don't necessarily get down to that younger level. So what we try to do is we recognize that if part of our operating environment was we are going to be dropping bombs in close proximity to guys that are on the ground. The guys on the ground may be getting shot at, you know, they may be under a lot of duress and a lot of pressure. We gotta make sure that every bomb counts, and we take out the enemy. So we actively try to seek out those joint training opportunities. So taking care of the families and making sure that the guys are ready. That's really kind of what we did firsthand. Absolutely.
Just real quick here, I just want to add on that. So at the tactical level, on the ground, you know, the Air Force provides what's called TACPs. You guys have heard of TACPs. And with regards to doing a train-up for an infantry organization or an organization that's going to end up fighting on the ground, a lot of integration goes in initially, building all the way up to that deployment with those TACPs, even to the point of coming out and understanding capabilities of aircraft that will be supporting not just our own rotary wing, but also fixed wing, and just their capabilities and what the possibilities are in the event that, you know, I don't know, sir, one of the things I always had a question on, because I was trained as that I could call for air support. I got that skill identifier, but I recall just always being told that, hey, you need to make sure you always have a TACP on the ground because the Air Force pilots won't drop any bombs for an infantry company commander on the ground. That was almost 8 years ago. Is that still true? That you know, is that still true? Doing that?
No, that's not still true. Here's a little bit of dirty laundry, maybe a little bit of a soap opera as well. About, I don't know, it was maybe 5 years ago, we had a chief of staff of the Air Force and a secretary of the Air Force that were fired. They retired early, but in reality, they were fired. And one of the reasons that they were fired was because there was this big concern. Yeah, this was like 2007, 2008, you know, Fallujah was going on, all these other things. But there was this concern that the Air Force senior leadership was much more worried about F-22s, long-range strike bombers, you know, those type of things, and less focused on what the current requirements were, which quite honestly was, how do we best support the guys on the ground that are fighting through Baghdad and in Afghanistan. So there was a conscious effort after those folks were fired to, no kidding, go back and take a look at, first off, what is the culture within the Air Force? And then secondly, how do we best integrate from a joint perspective? So one of the outgrowths of that was, do we really need to have a TACP, you know, an Air Force qualified guy on the ground before we can drop bombs? And I'll tell you, there was we had one mission. It was actually pretty incredible. It was at night over by the Pakistan border, 16,000-foot mountains, you know, and we had guys that are outside the wire. They were in a troops in contact scenario. So the choice from our perspective was, do we get a Type 2 close air support talk-on from a TACP that's back at the Tactical Operations Center, you know, at the Ford operating base, or do we just talk to the guy that's direct down there? He's not necessarily fully qualified with the experience identifiers on it. Our decision was, we're going to talk to the guy that's actually on the ground getting shot at because he's got the best SA on this. And you know, we dropped bombs. It all worked out, a little bit of joint fire type thing. But it goes back to just really that kind of that culture and really understanding what the risk is for the guys that we were supporting on the ground.
You know, we get trained and all that kind of stuff to be able to talk to pilots or talk to aviators, and there's actually a script, you know, and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, if you just speak English and make it very clear where you are and where the bad guys are, and mark yourself or mark the bad guys, and talk in plain English to someone who's flying, you know, screaming at 10,000 feet above you, it's pretty easy. You know what I mean? And yep, I can identify that. Yep, here's a piece of terrain. Do you see that? Yep, Roger, I see that. Okay, enemy is 200 meters or 400 meters to the south of that. Can you identify? Roger, I got that. Okay, you're cleared hot. Here's my initials. Come get some, kind of thing.
Sir, it's funny that you say that, because that's right around the time where I was pulled out of the artillery corps and sent over to the space operations to pick up what Air Force captains were doing at one time. So right around that time, I didn't know that's what it was, but right around that time, the Army ended up picking up a payload control from our satellite piece. That's how. And that's, I never knew that.
Yeah, one thing that you'll notice as well is about that time frame, the Air Force, you know, our basic fighting unit is a wing. So you've got a wing that's commanded by a colonel, then you've got groups that are generally colonels as well, and then you've got your squadrons that are lieutenant colonel type of folks. But we've always had, you know, wings that have been formed around a specific airframe. You know, you get F-15, B-1, B-52, whatever. We stood up what we called the Air Ground Operations Wing as well. And that Air Ground Operations Wing was intended to have parity with our flying wings, so that we had all of our TACPs, all of those folks had a career path. So that actually, you know, it wasn't like just some special assignment, you You go serve 3 years here, and then you go back to the cockpit. But one thing I want to kind of emphasize right there that we talked about was the culture of the Air Force at that point. You know, our Chief of Staff of the Air Force and our Secretary of the Air Force, they were fired over that. And a lot of times we think that, well, it's really the guys up at the top that create that culture. And I think to an extent, that's true, but a lot of times it's really those frontline supervisors. It's the younger folks, the senior NCOs, those type of folks that are creating those individual unit cultures. So as a newly commissioned lieutenant, I would definitely recommend you go into those units, take a look at what that culture is, and be brutally honest with it. I think that your best leaders will be the ones that will take and respect your opinion on, as somebody that's new to a unit, what do you see from a culture? Now, some of them might tell you, hey, well, yeah, you're going, you know, you don't quite know the whole picture here. But I think anytime that we value those other opinions, especially when it comes to a culture of a unit, that can only help you increase the efficiency, really, and effectiveness. So that's kind of how I play that.
I've got something for you now, sir. You asked us to consider ISIS and all that, and then things start picking up what our concerns are. So, as a senior leader, what do you think, well, what have you seen in the past being specific challenges for new leaders facing overseas or just in new environments in general, and dealing with that? Because recently we've been talking a lot about how to be a good leader as far as taking care of your platoon, specifically really caring for your people and being the best you can be. So specifically to being overseas in new environments and whatnot, what do you think, what have you seen in the past, or how do you address that?
I would say that really, the one word that first came to mind was conformity. Avoid conformity. There's always this concern of, hey, you know, I'm the new guy, you know, I'm the second lieutenant, I've got to conform to what has been done in the past. And that may be very true, you know, but at the same time, maybe things that we've learned or things that have been done in the past, that may not necessarily be the case as to what we need to succeed once we're overseas or once we're in an environment. You know, I'm sure you studied General McMaster's and everything that he did in Iraq, HR McMaster, General Odierno, those type of folks. My God, General Petraeus is probably a great example. Here's a guy, albeit a 4-star general, but he broke with tradition, especially in the Army, you know, when they started to really focus on an academic rigor and adding a lot of counterinsurgency into really what is a core, you know, the core Army warfighting function, right? They rewrote FM 3-24, but it was because they did not necessarily think that we had to conform to what was done in the past. And that's where I go back to what I said earlier. We talked about, you know, we've got 20 years of experience. You guys have 20 years of potential. It's the potential that's tempered by the experience. So we're not looking for folks necessarily to be the exact same as we start coming. If that makes sense.
So it makes sense, sir. So what you're saying is be yourself. Kind of don't be afraid to. It's gonna be a challenge.
Yeah.
Especially if you have a lot of seasoned people, especially coming in. If you're thrown into that as a brand new, you know, second lieutenant, but basically, if you think you can do better, don't be afraid to speak up.
I was, yeah, that's exactly it. Because I was asked by a bunch of Air Force lieutenants about 3 weeks ago, what was the one thing that I regretted when I was a first lieutenant, you know, second lieutenant, first lieutenant. And I told them I regretted that I really regretted that I tried very hard to kind of fit in with the rest of the, you know, the fighter pilots out there, you know. And this, I mean, honestly, this was mid-90s, so, you know, there was a lot of cultural type issues that, you know, to be a great fighter pilot wasn't necessarily just to fly the jet. It was, you know, to be in the bar, to be hanging out with the bros, those type of things. And that really detracted kind of really from, I think, what I could have individually contributed to my unit. Because we said, hey, you know, you're gonna be just like him because he makes a great fighter pilot, you know? And that was, looking back in retrospect, that was the wrong thing to do. You know? When it comes to tactics and techniques, you know, for how we're maybe doing a mission, it's good to have the same type of tactics, techniques, and be able to execute it. But when it comes to leadership and, you know, those type of issues, taking care of the soldiers and the airmen, what I really want is a lot of initiative that's based upon the situation that I see. Is there a question or anybody directly? Okay. So, I would say that when you are entering the military, you've all talked obviously about senior NCOs and your NCOs, right? What's kind of the philosophy right now on NCOs and senior NCOs? You're smiling.
Definitely trust them, you know, learn from them, trust them as well. Because, I mean, they've been there longer than you have, so obviously just not so much fall in their footsteps, but, you gotta be the leader that you're there to be, but kind of follow them as well, in a certain way.
It's a fine balance, I think, because as the incoming, lieutenant, as somebody new to the unit, you're a leadership team. You really are. Be it a lieutenant and a sergeant, be it, a captain and a sergeant first class, you guys are a team. And especially going into being a combat controller, man, I mean, you can learn a lot from your NCOs and your senior NCOs. But I would say at the same time, temper that with, from a senior leader perspective, I'm looking at you as the lieutenant as being responsible for that mission. So I want you to actively listen to and be a team with your NCO, with your senior NCO, but at the same time, I want you to make sure that you've got the confidence and really the competency in order to lead your unit. So kind of a tough thing to balance out there, but something I definitely recommend to kind of take a look at and focus on once you get into your units out there. Okay. And quite honestly, just like there's, good and bad colonels and toxic leadership, there's, good and bad lieutenants and good and bad NCOs as well. So I would say just always make sure that we take a look and make sure that we're all compliant. Yeah. Okay. 4 years, you've been in ROTC for 4 years, right? 2 years? 4 years? Yeah.
I've been in 2 years, sir.
2 years? What's one thing that, looking back on those 2 years, that you would like to have maybe focused on a little bit more, or you think that maybe hasn't totally prepared you for when you join, when you get into the Army?
That's a little different. I'm active duty, so I'm coming in. I have 7 years in now, so I'm trying to transition from being active duty coming into the ROTC program. It's been slightly different. So it's been a little more, coming into the program, being an NCO, it was a step down because we have to find a common ground to kind of develop and build everybody up. So for me, it's been slightly different. Some of my peers may see it differently because they don't have that active duty experience. So for them, seeing it, it's slightly different. But for me, it was a step down and then develop back up.
Okay. So coming in as an NCO, what was one thing that, from what you saw from your young officers, from your lieutenants, that maybe they did good, maybe they could have done a little bit better?
Communication. For the most part, a lot of them were afraid to say something. They wholeheartedly relied on their NCOs to kind of do everything for them instead of taking some type of ownership of their unit or their platoon at that point in time. They really stepped back and just allowed the NCOs to do everything. Ultimately, there was really no need for them other than to sign documentation. But I feel if they had spoken out more, gotten to know their soldiers more, and interacted more in terms of the communication aspects, it would have developed a greater understanding of that unit and that platoon. It didn't happen every single time. Some of my officers did it, a lot of my first lieutenants didn't.
That's one thing that, I bet you the ones that didn't speak out probably didn't actively see feedback as well, did they?
Not
They were
from
kind of
my
content, like you were saying, they were content maybe just to sit at the desk and sign the forms, those type of things. 360 feedback, have you guys done that?
Yes.
Yes. Who said yes? Somebody said yes? What do you think of it? Yeah. I would recommend 360 feedback, those type of things as a lieutenant, and not necessarily formal, but maybe sit down with your NCOs, maybe some of the younger there's going to be informal leaders. There's always informal leaders in any type of road unit. Maybe identify who those are, but sit down and talk to those folks and try to figure out, hey, what should we be doing as a leadership team, or what are potentially other ways that we could be doing things maybe a little bit better. One of the biggest things I think that definitely in the Air Force that we do is we debrief like crazy. We really do. And I'm sure it's the same in the Army as well, man. You always, you sit down, you think, what in the world you're involved. But it's not, I would say the debriefs wouldn't necessarily be practical. It's always good to just kind of step back a little bit and say, hey, what could we be doing better? What are some things that good, bad, or otherwise, So I would recommend that because I think that that'll help with the communications, and it'll quite honestly make you a better leader as well, I believe, over time. Is that kind of not what the folks were doing that you saw?
There was no feedback. It was a matter of putting in some time to get to a certain level before they actually opened their mouth. But that was just from my experience.
Okay. What else, anything else that I could tell you from an Air Force perspective? What have you learned from an Air Force ROTC? What are some things that maybe we've mentioned that may be a little bit different than what you've brought up or you've heard?
Well, one thing that I kind of wish, I mean, I'm a junior, still another year, but I guess one thing I kind of wish I focused on more, I guess more pertaining to the job I'm trying to get into, maybe kind of more of an assertive or aggressive leadership role. Because I know in Air Force ROTC, we learn a lot of this kind of democratic and kind of accommodating leadership that's a lot of focused on, you know, what everyone else's needs. But sometimes going into combat control, I have to be more assertive and more aggressive, which isn't always the best option in Air Force ROTC, but you know, it's something they look for when they go to phase 2 or when they go to selection. So that's something I wish I focused on more.
Gotcha. Yeah, leadership is very situational. I'll give you a story. You guys may have seen this. If there's a blog. It's called John Q. Public. It's Air Force specific. But we had a 2-star general that was recently relieved of command because he was a bit too assertive, a bit too aggressive. What he really said was he was in a room with a bunch of captains, majors, and lieutenant colonels, and he basically said, "Hey, it is absolute treason if you go to Congress and say that the Air Force needs to keep the A-10." Kind of a bad thing to say, you know. He started off the comment with, "I'll deny this if anybody says I said it." So first off, if you're ever starting a comment like that, probably a bad thing. But it's one of those things where you got to be careful from a leadership style perspective, because there's times where the aggressive, assertive leadership may not be the best way to go. And you know, we've all been there where we've had folks that they respond very well to aggressive leadership. You know, for the folks that are going infantry, you're probably going to be a bit more aggressive in your leadership philosophy than maybe the folks who are going into medical. Complete stereotype, I know, but that may be the case. And it really kind of boils down to what are my subordinates? What motivates them? Because not everybody's going to be motivated the same way. You know, some folks are going to serve in 4 years in the military, get out. Some folks are going to go, from the enlistment to a commissioning service. Some folks want to be, chief of staff in the Army and the Air Force. So it's kind of understanding that motivation and adapting that leadership style so that, folks that are aggressive and assertive, they may be great in certain cases, but they may fail miserably in other cases. When we think of great leaders, first off in the Army, who do you think of? Who's the first person that comes to your mind?
Me, sir?
Yeah. When we think of leadership, great leaders in the Army?
Honestly, I was going to say Colonel Purser. Or that was thinking like, no, it was in my mind. That's why I stayed quiet.
Me trying to get in.
Okay.
Because when you talk about being an adaptive leader, when you talk about being an adaptive leader, Colonel Carson, he's branched infantry and he's been in for 20 years or more. I'm not sure his answer. But so he came into the program as a PMS, and he had to adapt to our situation where not all of us are active duty, not all of us have ever joined the service or raised our right hand, and then on top of that, we're all college students. We still have college classes. So he had to adapt from an infantry perspective to college professor / PMS / commander and fill in all those roles. And so him being able to adapt and understand our situations better as students, as sons and daughters still, some of us never raised our right hand, like I said, I thought was very admirable of him, and I respected that because it showed that he cared about us, and he really did want to teach us something, and he had to do that, so.
Thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot. Very nice. But no, and that exactly. But that kind of illustrates the point as well, because if you're in downtown Kandahar, or you're on the Afghan-Pakistan border, or you're in Syria, that leadership style is going to be very different than talking to a person that is in college, never raised their hand, and that's really where that adaptive leadership comes into play. One thing I think that the Army does very well is leader development as a whole. I think they do it much better, honestly, than what we do in the Air Force. I think the Marines do it good. What I've seen from the Navy and the Air Force are kind of a lower echelon than what the Army on leader development, but it's because it's inculcated at every single level. Now, as an 06, I may not know the privates and all those folks that are at the squad level, but you would expect that the lieutenants would be able to understand the motivations of how we can get that mission accomplished and young soldier to do whatever task has been asked. Just a consideration, but the adaptive leadership part is huge. It really is. Yes, ma'am.
I was gonna say, definitely along with what Baba said, knowing your subordinates really matter because from what he's used to, we were college students, and I just did this thing on Task Force Smith, how you have to like know your subordinates, and you have to know the readiness level and all that. So it's basically like.
Where did you learn about Task Force Smith?
Well, from military history.
Oh, really?
Because there was like an utter failure, but we learned from it because the leadership do not know their soldiers and their capabilities. And so you basically should like, you need to know the enemy as well as like yourself and your subordinates' capabilities.
Well, it does. Are you guys here just a minute? And to caveat that, you know, from an 06 level, I don't ever want to put anybody in danger. But in order for me to make those appropriate decisions, I have to get the best advice from those subordinate commanders. And if a subordinate commander doesn't know what their readiness level is, they don't know what type of equipment they need, they don't know what the capabilities of their soldiers are, then it's probably going to increase the risk, you know, because I'll make an assumption that everybody is gung-ho ready for green on their readiness assessment, when that may not necessarily be the case. The other part of it goes back to what he was saying too, making sure to be able to not only know that, but then to communicate it as well, so we can make those best decisions.
Sir, I spent 6 years in the Air Force before switching over.
What'd you do?
I started out for 3 years. I started out as an E&E specialist on the A-10 aircraft. But but I know, you know, pilots, they wanted to be one with their aircraft. You know, that was their baby. But you know, my pilot, you know, he came down and spoke to us every day. He made it his priority to talk to us. And for him, that was making sure that his aircraft was safe because we were in charge of his safety. You know, he said his job was easy. He was like, you know, it took a college degree for me to fly it, but you know, you guys, high school diploma, we're the ones actually taking care of that aircraft. So, you know, he came out there and really made us want to take care of that aircraft, no matter how long it took. From, you know, I don't know, taking out the EPU was it wasn't fun, but you know, we didn't care if we had to stay up to 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning changing that EPU because we know he had to go out there and do what he had to do. But the fact that he came down there and checked up on us, just communicating the smaller things, going back to what Cadet Gibson talked about, just communication. You know, sometimes just checking up on your soldier and just having a baseline conversation. I think that was one of the positive things that I learned from the Air Force, especially with pilots. You know, they really check on the people that take care of their baby, which is the aircraft. You know, and they work kind of like as a unit. They're not looked at as, I'm your boss or I'm your commander. I'm right to your side. We're all in this together. This is our aircraft, and you know, the best way for us to be successful is if we're all on the same page communicating. So that was.
That's exactly right, man. And that's a big difference between what you saw in the Air Force and kind of what we see in the Army. Because in the Air Force, for folks that don't know, you've got the guys that fly the planes are in one unit, and then the maintenance squadron was you were not in the fighter squadron, right?
No, sir.
No. So you've got the fighter squadron, so all the pilots and everybody that flies the planes, and you got the maintenance squadron, all the folks that work on it. Because those are two very separate organizations, not everybody is as lucky. You know, they have the pilots come down and talk to the maintainers, and have the maintainers actually have a good relationship with the pilots. So it goes back to, first off, an organizational issue, but then also there's a little bit of a culture issue there as well. But you can see just a simple act of the folks coming down and talking pays huge dividends. It really does. And that's kind of what I've noticed, at least in my time, my brief time as a commander of my current unit, as well as my previous time, is if we show a little bit of compassion for the folks, making sure that we understand maybe some of those stressors that our young folks are under, as well as maybe what some of their goals and desires are in the military, that goes a long ways to having a good unit. Yes,
So
ma'am.
do you do counseling also? In the Army, they do counseling, and so you sit down with all your subordinates and go through their expectations and their
I do. Right now, it's about every 6 months for the formal part, because we do, you know, the 6 months, you know, you do your formal counseling, and then you finish the OPR and the EPR. But then there's a lot of informal counseling that goes on as well. Like we talked earlier, I'm kind of a big fan of the 360 evaluations. I truly do appreciate if, you know, if it's Airman Harris or if it's, you know, a fellow colonel that is telling me, hey, this probably isn't the right thing to do, because it's all about different perspectives, and making sure the folks are, you bring all of that in. I would say, when we start talking about those evaluations and that type of feedback, as a leader, you have to actively seek it out, because a lot of folks may not necessarily give you the type of feedback that you desire. So it is always going to be an active and probably a very iterative process as well. The other part of that is, from a leadership perspective, making sure that you're using that feedback appropriately. You know, what you don't want is somebody comes up to you with the best of intentions and says, hey, I think that what we did there was probably not the right thing to do, and you snap at it and you kind of turn it off. Because if you really value the feedback, then there should be some mechanism that shows that their feedback was important. Makes sense? There was, I think you had a question. Did you have another question too?
Oh, I didn't have a question, sir. I was just gonna mention that I didn't grow up reading a lot of books about military leaders or military leadership in general. So the way that I learn about what good leadership is through first-hand experiences. And until I can get to that level of knowing when the next book comes out for military leadership or what they've learned and can apply it to today, that's how I go about to envision what kind of styles of leadership I can pull from somebody and then others that I should avoid is through first-hand experiences.
I would say that you've got just the very generic perception. But I think there's three different types of leadership out there. Okay, when we start talking about leadership studies, the first is, there's the officer leadership. There's the people that make it, 2, 3, 4-star generals, and kind of what they did. A lot of times, when we look at that type of leadership, though, we're looking at what do they do as as a division or a corps, army commander, secretary of state, something like that. So sometimes that may not necessarily be as applicable to folks that are just starting out, the lieutenants, the captains, and the colonels. The second type of leadership that I think that we have out there is the enlisted leadership. I would highly, this is something that we don't do. I would definitely recommend you do this as you become a second lieutenant. This is something in the Air Force we don't necessarily do well, is understanding what the enlisted leadership really is, as far as, the pamphlets, reading those type of pamphlets, understanding the importance of our NCOs and our senior NCOs. I think that some of the best leadership, quite honestly, is for us in that E7 and E8 ranks, and then our chief master sergeants, which are our E9s. So please don't ever discount the leadership studies that you can do from either the enlisted PME or that enlisted first-hand experience. The other leadership school that I think is gaining a lot of traction in the military is the civilian leadership. I personally am a big fan of Steve Jobs, and I look at his biography or autobiography. But there's LinkedIn always has great, in my mind, they've got great comments from civilian leadership out there. And so I would recommend, don't hesitate to look at what civilian leaders are doing. Because a lot of times, a lot of the things that they are doing, the situations that they are in, can also have pretty significant impact to what we're doing from a military perspective. Yeah.
Based off of that, do you feel that part of the reason why it applies and it's becoming more prevalent in our forces now, do you feel that that's because our culture as a military is changing towards a more enterprise style function versus a traditional military or contact Cold War, World War I style military?
Yeah, I do. I think that's part of it. I think the other cultural part of it as well is folks don't necessarily see that big of a difference between the military and the civilian sector when it comes to really some of the things that we are doing out there. My oldest son, he got accepted into the Air Force Academy, did 2 years at the academy, and said, man, this isn't at all what I want to do. So he got financially, it sucked. But he made the right decision, and for him, he made the right decision. But it was because he wanted to go more towards that civilian sector. Because folks are getting a greater understanding, I think, of what is needed for success, civilian-wise, and potentially how that can be applied. For us in the Air Force, in the past, it's been a lot about, dropping bombs, flying the jets. Our mission is changing a lot to more of the silent perspective. Everybody's is. More towards the space perspective. And these are a lot of areas where there's a direct civilian type of an influence as well. So a lot of our practices are mirroring what, the Honeywells and the big space and cyber, IBMers, what they do. That help?
Yes, sir.
So I would say that those are kind of maybe some of the three different leadership areas, as opposed to maybe focusing on what worked well for a specific demographic. I want to go back to your question real quick about feedback. The other time that I do feedback is any time that there's a significant professional event that is affecting somebody's career. And, for us, we've got that 6-month mandatory feedback, and then we get the officer's performance report. The other part is when folks are going for their professional military education, when they're competing for that, when we're writing their promotion recommendation forms, or they're going up for anything, then I will give them feedback as well. And it's as simple as just trying to be as honest as possible with them and saying, hey, I had 12 people that were eligible. You're number 3 of 12 that way. I don't know what it was like necessarily in the Army, but at least in the Air Force, sometimes we have a tendency not to be as totally honest, and I've been guilty of it too, not to be as totally honest maybe where necessarily folks stand for their chances for the next rank or the next opportunity. I think that's something we all need to work on and get a little bit better, is to be honest with where the folks are. But at the same time, it goes back to understanding what an individual's goals and motivations are, and then trying to set them up for success, if we can. Just to kind of quickly attack on that.
Event oriented, professional event.
Professional event oriented, yeah. So like for us specifically, if you were in my unit, before you went off to squadron officers school, I'd sit down and I would talk with you about it. Before you tried to do some type of other type of, maybe a career broadening assignment, we would sit down and talk about it, those type of things. Yeah.
Sir, if you're sitting down with one of your new second lieutenants